Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Article 5 of Question 46 of Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae, Thomas Aquinas is going to ask a very interesting question. Is anger, ira, more natural, naturalior, than desire, concupiscentia, right? So there's a comparison here of anger and desire going on, and you can sort of figure out the reasoning for this if you know some Aristotle, as he's going to mention in the on the other hand, or the sed contra part. There is Aristotle's statement, anger is more natural than desire, which Aristotle is going to make in the discussion of the difference between losing control or lack of control with respect to desire for bodily pleasures and doing so motivated by anger. And so Aristotle's statement is not necessarily intended to be a blanket statement. And as we're going to see, Thomas does think that in some ways anger is more natural and in other ways desire or appetite, or however you want to express it, is more natural. So he starts out by looking at three possible arguments for why desire would be, in every case, more natural. And the first one has to do with human beings being more natural, being more naturally gentle animals, right? It says proprium. So what is distinctive to human beings is said to be a animal mansuetum natura, to be a gentle animal by nature. Now, that's kind of a strange statement, but what could you argue from that? Well, then anger is going against our nature. As he says, it seems to be completely contrary to human nature. Well, in that case, anger is kind of an aberration, right? And desire would be more natural then, because it's something that we experience. In the second argument, he's going to rely on a distinction which we might not in the modern age completely understand or recognize just from how he's saying it. He tells us that we distinguish, right, or more properly, we divide things into reason and nature, right? So we make a distinction, as he says, between acting according to reason and acting according to nature. And now this is something that in the medievals we see reflected. There is this entire world of nature that was created by God, and everything has its own nature that it acts according to, except for things that have, on the one hand, reason, and on the other hand, will, and specifically a will capable of free choice. Things of that sort are said to be of the rational order. They could choose to do otherwise. So like fire can't help but burn, but if you've got a fire, you can burn things with it or cook things with it or put it out, right? You have choices. And so if that's the case, then he says that in the ethics we read anger obeys reason, desire does not. So again, invoking Aristotle. So again, desire more natural than anger. The third one is very interesting. He says, Anger is a craving, or literally an appetite for vengeance, while the emotion of desire, concupiscentia, is a craving for pleasures of touch above all. Again, where is this coming from? From Aristotle, right? Aristotle's discussion in the Nicomachean Ethics. And he says, namely, for food and for sex matters, veneriorum. So he says that these are more natural to a human being than vengeance is. Therefore, desire is going to be more natural than anger. So we've got three arguments for saying anger, okay, it could be natural to some degree, but desire is way more natural than that. And then Thomas says, after invoking Aristotle, well, we need to think about this in terms of causes. So he says, what is naturally produced, what is produced through nature, naturale, is called natural, as is clear from Aristotle's physics. And so he says, only considering the causes can determine whether an emotion is more or less natural. So notice he's willing to say that some emotions could be more natural than others. So how do we make sense of this? He says, well, we need to consider it in terms of its object, what it is that it's aiming at, right? What it's intended towards, and the subject, the subjectum, the being that the emotion is taking place in. Now, here's where it gets very interesting, because Thomas is willing to say, listen, if we think in terms of the object, actually, anger is less natural than desire is. Why is that the case? He says desire, particularly the desire for food and venereal pleasure, sexual pleasure, is more natural than anger, because these are more natural than what is aimed for in anger, the objectum, the object, revenge, vindication. What about in terms of the subject? So here he makes a very interesting distinction. He says that when we're thinking about anger in terms of the subject, in one sense, anger is more natural, and in another sense, desire is. Why is this? Because human nature can be understood in three different ways, three different levels, you could say. So at the highest level of generality, we've got the generic, we are animals, right? And then we have the species, humanity, what is distinctive about the species, rationality. And then each one of us as an individual person has our own, and we could translate it in various ways, our own temperament, our own makeup, our own way of being in the world, secundum proprium complexionem. Each of us has a complexio, literally how things are folded together. So if we think about it in terms of the generic, as an animal, he says that desire is more natural than anger then. Why? By reason of our generic nature, a human being is inclined to desire what will conserve life, either one's own or that of the race. We have a natural inclination. When he talks about the natural law, this is something that he appeals to. And food and sex are, you could say, more common and natural ways of carrying out that inclination. So they're in some way more natural than seeking out revenge or vindication. But when we get to the level of the species, we're no longer looking at human being as just an animal, but the rational animal. Here Thomas will say anger is more natural to us human beings, than is desire. Why? Because there's more rationality, there's more reason involved in anger than in desire. So Aristotle actually is going to say, and Thomas follows him here, that revenge or imposing some sort of vindication on the other person is more human than gentleness. So even though we might be said to be a gentle animal, we actually are more prone to anger
than to gentleness. And I think this is borne out in many respects. He says it's natural for anything to be aroused against what's hostile and threatening. And you could actually read between the lines and say, yeah, those human beings, they see lots and lots of things as hostile and threatening. It's part of their common life, their common nature. And then he says, if we're thinking about a given individual, right, in terms of their unique temperament, right, again, secundum proprium complexionem, then, again, anger is more natural than desire. Why? He says, anger is easily aroused as a result of a natural temperamental inclination to irascibility. Irascibility is the tendency to get angry, the disposition. He actually uses the word dispositus here. So, the disposition to get angry. Why? And here he makes an appeal to a medical theory that we don't really buy into anymore, that of the different humors. He says an irascible disposition is characteristic of a choleric temperament. Some people are just more irascible because they have more black bile within their system, and choler is more quickly aroused than the other humors, than, say, blood or lymph or spleen or any of those sorts of things. It's said to be like fire. Fire is much more easily aroused. So, if you're the kind of person who has this temperament of irascibility, then anger is, in a certain respect, more natural to you. Is this saying that it's natural to everybody in this way? No, he's not claiming that. He is just saying, we've already got the human species, anger is more natural, but some people are even more prone to that, you could say. Now, he has a lengthy discussion of the first argument. Human beings, right, by nature are supposed to be gentle. And he says that we can consider human beings in two different ways. We can think about how our bodies work and how the humors come together, the complexio of those things, our temperament, and then we can think about our rationality. So if we consider it in terms of our makeup or temperament, then the human being is actually kind of a balanced animal. By contrast to the other animals, which go this way or this way or this way, we have kind of an equilibrium or a balance or a harmony between these things. So he says a human being is not naturally and essentially endowed with an overpowering disposition either to anger or any other emotion. The other animals lack this constitutional equilibrium, so it's natural for them to be excessively inclined to a particular emotion. And he uses dog as an example of an animal that is inclined to anger, interestingly enough, to ira. And so, the human being is, in that respect, could be gentle or could be angry, right? But, he says, as far as his rationality is concerned, it is natural for a human being to become angry, right? But also to be gentle. Both of them are possibilities for us. And he says, on the one hand, anger may be called for by reason. Reason realizes that there's a threat that needs to be protected against. And on the other hand, reason can subdue anger. So, is this saying this argument is completely wrong? No, but it's responding to it in a very interesting way. The second one, right, saying that there's a distinction between the rational and the natural, our nature is to be rational, right? That is what is our species. We are the rational animal. So this distinction, making an argument based on this distinction is just not going to really work. So he says, from the fact that anger is accompanied by an act of reason, it follows, in some sense, anger is natural to the human being. So when we're considering, whether anger is more natural, less natural, right? For us human beings, it is, at least in this respect, more natural. And then for the third argument, he actually says the argument deals with anger and desire in terms of their object. Obviously, in terms of the object, desire is more natural. Fine, we'll concede that. So what we've got here is some very interesting reflections on how natural anger is to us human beings in comparison to desire for bodily pleasures, and it's using this threefold distinction between ways in which we can talk about our nature. We have a generic nature, we have a specific nature, and then we have a unique temperament as individual human beings.